started. I'm John Morey. For anybody I haven't met, there's a lot of you here. I'm chair of the Mountain Towns Red Board, and I guess that I will facilitate just because you know it's our hometown. So, but I think we have to individually call our board meetings to order. So I would like to call the Mountain Towns Red Board meeting to order as of 7:04, and the other board chairs I think need to do the same.
I'll call the Manchester Elementary School, Middle School Board meeting to order. And
we'll call the Dorset meeting to order. It is whatever it is.
7:04, 5. Great, and I would suggest that we go around and introduce ourselves next, because those of us who are all on the BRSU board kind of know each other, but there's a lot of us who aren't, and so we don't know who we are. So should we start over here?
I'm Tom Quinn. I'm principal at Manchester Elementary Middle School.
Brian Vogel, MEMS Board Chair.
Mary Beth O'Donnell, MEMS School Board.
Steve Murphy, MEMS School Board.
Charlie Cade, Mountain Towns Red.
Jeff Cleary, Mountain Towns Red.
Dan French, Superintendent of the RSU.
John Morey from Mountain Towns Red.
Neil McIntyre, principal at Flood Brook School.
Wendell Coleman, Mountain Towns Red.
John Wilson from MEMS.
Mark Capps, MEMS.
Deb Linus from Mountain Towns Red.
Carrie Chalmers from Mountain Towns Red.
Rosalind Cleason from Mountain Towns Red.
Jennifer Allen from Dorset.
David Chandler from Dorset.
Vicki Haskins from Dorset.
Jim Miranda from Dorset.
Jim Salzgiver from Dorset.
And Jackie Wilson, assistant principal. I was one time.
Welcome everyone, and welcome all of you. I'm not sure, I guess that we all got in our agenda packet from Dan and Jackie some discussion that was sort of aimed at helping us organize our discussion tonight, so it probably makes sense to use that as a starting point, that we had a chance to read through it. And have all of your boards met and had some Act 46 discussion to start with? So you have, and you guys have. Great. So I know all of our individual boards that have had some preliminary discussion. And so I'll try to just summarize quickly, and even less than the one page Dan provided here, what's at issue, and I think what the idea of tonight's meeting is about. Under Act 46, there are two possible governance structures. One is what's considered the preferred governance structure, which is a supervisory district, where there is one district, and the other is the alternative governance structure, is a supervisory union made up of what's considered the least practicable number of districts. And there are certain numbers of students that those districts, either the supervisory district needs to have in order to form a district, and that number is, for a supervisory district, 900, is that the right number? To form that preferred district. So there are a number of options open to all of the districts in the BRSU, but the Mountain Towns Red, Manchester, and Dorset, having the most students, have at least one other option open to them, which would be to merge in some way in a departure from the BRSU and form the preferred governance structure, a supervisory district, because we could meet the 900 student requirement in any combination with Manchester, I think would have to be involved. But us Manchester, Dorset Manchester, or the three of our districts would have enough students to form a supervisory district. It's also true that all the schools that form a district at least probably need to have the same school choice structure, which we all currently have. We all tuition we all run schools for K to 8 and tuition 9 to 12. And key factors that play in here are, one is the tax incentives provided by the state. There are the best tax incentives offered for formation of the preferred governance structure, the supervisory district. For districts that form those within 1 year, a breakneck pace, there are tax rate reductions of 10 cents, 8 cents, 6 cents, 4 cents, and 2 cents over 5 years once the district is formed. That's if we form that preferred structure within 1 year. If it's formed within 2 years, you still get tax rate reductions of 8, 6, 4, and 2 cents, I guess over 4 years. But there are no tax incentives for forming the alternative governance structure, the supervisory union. So there have been at the BRSU board level and in the BRSU governance committee quite a bit of discussion already about possible structures that could be formed within the BRSU. One option is that the BRSU remains as a supervisory union, but there's a bunch of mergers within it to form the least practicable number of districts, which would likely involve Manchester, Dorset, and the Mountain Towns Red having to merge anyway and remain part of the BRSU, along with the other towns who could also remain part of the BRSU. So I think the idea is that the main focus of tonight's meeting is to throw around a little bit the possibilities and discuss whether our 3 districts really have any interest of pursuing the preferred governance structure, the preferred governance structure, which is the supervisory district, which would mean leaving the BRSU, with or without possibly other districts changing their choice structures and joining us. So Dan posed a couple questions for us. The first is, well, they all are sort of, to what extent do the boards want to, number one was study the formation of a preferred governance structure. And second is to study the formation of alternative governance structure among the current BRSU districts. And so I guess in order to provide some structure, I would recommend we maybe start with discussing the pros and cons of forming the preferred governance structure. If anybody feels like there's a better way to organize the discussion, please feel free to speak up.
Actually,
yeah,
we want to address the audience to make sure they understood what you said. If there's any question about what you said, if they have any concerns leading into this that we can take into account. Or
sure, absolutely. Yeah, anybody can feel free to raise your hand and ask questions anytime. I've been sitting through a lot of meetings about this already, so I have my head around it, but I know that it is overwhelmingly confusing, and a lot of things that sound the same are profoundly different to the state. So yeah, feel free to raise your hand and ask questions, and I can try to explain what we've discussed so far.
So John, doesn't seem to be any questions. I just want to address 2 things that you said just on point of clarification. The 1 year time frame, that's actually to set up and be approved, and then it's another year to become operational. So that's for July 1 of 2017 to become operational for an SD to be considered for the full tax benefit.
I think that's correct. Is that correct, Dan? Yes. That's your understanding, yes. So our voters would have to approve that, though, next spring.
It would have to be approved. Our towns would have to approve it.
All of our towns.
All our towns. And then there's a caveat there. And then the state would have to approve us.
Yeah.
Again,
the state would approve the plan before we even voted on it. We'd submit a plan to the state.
Voters vote twice. They vote initially to authorize the study committee. The study committee produces a report that goes to the state approves it. The voters vote again.
Yeah.
Okay. And then we become operational a year after that.
Yeah.
No, I mean, just as an example, if the voters voted this spring, March 2016, step 1, it goes to the state board. The voters vote March 2017. It goes operational 3 months from them.
March 2017.
July 1, 2017, the new district comes into formation.
Okay, I'm sorry. That's a good clarification, but when John said a year from now, it makes it sound like it's locked in at 2016. The procedures happen in 2016, start in 2016, but in order to get the maximum tax benefit, we must be operational by July 1 of 2017.
Right. So there's 2 years to become operational.
Yeah.
Okay. The other point is that you said that there's no tax incentive for an SU, but what potentially could be discussed here is creating a supervisory district, which, at least for the time being, the red benefits still apply.
Yes, I did not mention that.
Somewhat similar, although certainly less than the incentives for an SD.
Well, actually, they're the same as the incentives for an SD under the non-accelerated The incentives are 8,
Right.
6, 4, 2 cents.
My point being, you don't get the 10-cent reduction the first year.
Right.
Is that accurate, Dave?
Yes, that's my
that's one
understanding.
Okay, so, great job summarizing. I also have been spending a lot of time in meetings.
One more clarification on what you just said about voting. Just to be clear, because this came up in our discussions about it, when people vote on this, it's not town, it's district. So for our case, we have 4 towns, but we're actually voting together as a district. So my little town can't just secede from the red and go away and do something else.
And something else that came up in the BRSU meeting that was asked, if, say, 2 of the 3 towns say yes and go through and 1 town secedes, again, assuming that 1 town is not Manchester because of numbers, we can still proceed with 2 towns on something like this.
Yeah,
so,
as long as there's 9 proceedings.
Right, so it's not an all or none proposition.
Yeah.
Another clarification question, John. Is it the citizens that vote to form a study committee or the boards that vote? For informing Reds, I'm sure it was the school boards that voted, and so unless that's been changed in 46, then it's the public vote is only on the plan.
No, my understanding, and this goes back to Section 706, which is the statute that governs the formation of union school districts, that requires 2 votes of the voters. The first vote to form the study committee, because the study committee under the law is empowered to do some things, and they have some requirements. That's my understanding, is that it's a 2 vote from the voters. And I think we've seen that go forward a couple times with union mergers where some people don't go along with it. But that's a good point. I mean, conversation starts to go down those paths, we'll certainly verify those options, but what we're talking about with Act 153, 883, which never became law, and this law, it doesn't really change the formation process. That's still been in statute for many years now, since the 50s and 60s. We call 706. The process of merging districts has been around a while. This just sort of adds incentives and timelines and policy objectives and so forth. But we'll have to go back and really, go through that section of the law to make sure the point Wendell's bringing up is true.
Yeah, I'm just kind of curious that, Dan's had some experiences up in Montpelier and with, folks involved with this. And, one question I have on the idea of, looking at doing the SD is that piece about the State Board of Education and an agency of education have to approve us. And if we did go the direction of an SD, I know that they want that to happen as frequently as possible, but to the extent that it created, it left some people out that are currently with us, do you get the impression that's going to have a significant impact on the likelihood of getting approved or not?
That's an open question. We've had, yourself, Wendell, Gordon, who's not here tonight, heard some preliminary thinking from some of the folks involved in that. The State Board itself has been working on this over the summer. But on the one hand, my understanding or the perception of where they're at with this right now is, on the one hand, they're anxious for some successes in terms of the preferred governance structure. And they acknowledge that it's unlikely from where they're sitting that they can figure out the best way for that to happen. So they're anxious for locals to present to them structures that make sense at the local level. So that's one set of objectives. I think what they're working on now, though, is that criteria of looking at geographic isolation, or what is the bigger picture going to look like in 2019. And I think, it's a tension. That's largely, we're talking about political motivations now. Is there going to be successes under this because this is a high-stakes piece of legislation? Is it going to work? On the other hand, is it going to create a bigger mess than's out there now? It has to make sense. So they are working on sets of criteria to they're going to publish those criteria out in terms of what they're going to be looking for. But I think at this point we really don't know, what their decision-making process will look like.
Yeah. Since you brought up that meeting, the interesting thing was that meeting in Montpelier, that the SUs had the opportunity to meet with the Secretary of Education, VSBA, other people, And they seemed, at that point, it was kind of early in the process, I thought, but they seemed very open to making all sorts of changes and structures and all that. And I was just kind of assuming that, you know, they've kind of recognized that they have to look at the bigger picture a little bit more since then, since they've had a lot of discussions. But I'm just curious. I think, you know, I don't think State Board of Education and Agency of Education approvals are necessarily going to be rubber stamps.
Yeah, and when Marty Nadler and I recently went to the State Board's Governance Committee meeting, where there's, as I think you're aware, there's still some conflict in the law, and this is essential to our conversation about school choice. And there are some contradictions in the statute about this issue. Marty and I, sitting in the audience, sort of watched them go through this. What they decided to do this summer was to give this governance committee the charge of trying to sort this out, because they know there are several districts in the state that are going to be interested in moving forward now under the preferred option. They don't have time for the legislature to spend a whole season trying to fix the law or come up where they want to be. So the State Board feels some pressure to come up with some advisory interpretation of the law that can help people move forward now. Okay, and I'll let Marty speak for his perspective. But we sort of watch them work through a couple scenarios. You know, where districts, two SUs were there, sort of not necessarily presenting their case, but using their examples as a real live example for the governance committee to wrestle with this issue. And based on what I saw at our earlier meeting in June versus this meeting, I still saw there's consensus among the committee members that they wanted to be as receptive as possible to local solutions that are creative that the law might not have anticipated. At the same time, the head counsel for the AOE was sitting there going, don't forget, however, we need to make sure any proposal conforms to the law. So, you know, that's going to be an important check. So I think the political disposition is to support what people can come forward with, because there's so many unique circumstances. Like our situation is fairly unique. So many SUs are complex organizations that have unique circumstances. They want people to come up with solutions to that. At the same time, you know, the law says certain things, and any of these proposals have to be vetted against the law. And I think some of the folks that are going to come up pretty quickly, if they're going with the accelerated option, are going to go through this bit of turbulence perhaps where it's not so clear. And there's probably going to be an opportunity to make it clear. That's sort of the advantage of going earlier. But I don't know, Marty, would you agree with that? Or?
Yeah, I would. And I think that two things really struck me with what was coming out of the discussion. One was that it was clear that any decision to reorganize that was unconstitutional would be not supported. But anything that seemed to make good sense that the law was silent on would probably either the law would remain silent on, or somehow when the law was clarified, it then would be clarified within the law to be clear that it would be okay. Because if it made good sense, they wanted to make sure that it would allow it to happen, and they did not want people to have to wait to do things that seemed to make good sense because the law didn't say you could, and the law didn't say you couldn't. They said move forward if it seemed to make sense and it wasn't unconstitutional.
Yep.
I wondered if you got a sense from them, since the spirit of this law is consolidation, how amenable they would be to creating a new supervisory union, supervisory district with all the infrastructure and overhead that would take, splitting one supervisory district into two smaller ones. How do you think they would respond?
Yeah, I can't speak. Their disposition towards this will evolve in the coming weeks and months. But I think you're right. There's a tension there between wanting to see preferred governance structures be formed. Yeah. At the same time, the law says, we know this isn't going to work in all places. But we want to see if people can go forward and come up with some solutions. And I think right now they're supportive of expecting some creative solutions to be coming their way. But there's going to be some pushback, I think, from the folks that are attentive to what's in the law to say, that's great, and I'm glad the board, you want to support that, but look, this is a problem in the law. We are expecting them to produce some guidance on the choice issue at their September board meeting, so that's an important date. I was on their website today. They don't seem to have a date on their website, but I'll try to find that out. We will have, as you know, September 14th, Representative Olson has organized the forum. Representative Sharp, who's chair of the House Ed Committee, will be here, as well as Speaker Smith. And Representative Sharp was quite, frank in his comment. They asked him during this governance committee, he was there, what was the thinking? What were you thinking as the committee went on? And he said, there are places where we decided not to go. We just wanted to, this is where the law is kind of silent on some things. We were expecting that to be left at the local level. So they showed some restraint in not being overly directive, which was kind of interesting. But I think, once they're here, those would be great questions to ask them. And then likewise, on our leadership forum on the 17th, we will have Stephen Morse here. And we'll have some other folks from the region and so forth at that meeting. They're there to listen to our conversation, but it'd be interesting to hear his perspective. I'm sure he wouldn't hesitate to give it to you. He is a native of Southern Vermont and understands our districts quite well. But it'll be interesting to observe how their attitude changes as they start to see some of these proposals.
Yeah, David.
We understand, I want to move the discussion a little bit, so I'm going to throw something out there. There are a few assumptions. We understand that they want us to move. They want us to change our current governance structure from what it is now to something that is seen to be more efficient and therefore able to provide better education to a wider group of kids. The second assumption that I think we need to wrestle with is, does the BRSU, as it's currently configured, provide us more value than if we were on our own? Because if it does, then there is an incentive for all of us to try to find a way to preserve the BRSU structure. That means going to an alternative district approach. The third question is, we all want to take advantage of whatever incentives there are, because we know this is going to cost a lot more money than even education has been costing us now. This is going to increase our costs because we're going to be moving things around, researching things, spending extra money, as well as maintaining our education levels. So we want to take advantage of as many incentives as we can. So my question would be, if the law hasn't addressed it, or it has the law addressed the issue of, if we did form one district that was qualified as a supervisory district, therefore qualifies for the incentives, what would then prevent us to continue over time to add other districts to it so it evolves into an alternative district, and therefore we have our cake and eat it too? We can keep the BRSU structure over time, and we can take benefit of the tax incentives. Is there a way that we can ask questions so we have that opportunity to, as I said, make this work in our favor rather than become punitive?
It seems that, like, one issue, I guess, that I think that raises, if we form this preferred structure, then to join our districts, towns would have to change their choice structure to be the same as ours under the current law. So, at least under some interpretations. Marty.
Yeah, I don't know that you could create a supervisory district, which is a single district, and then create from that SD and SU by adding other districts to it, right, and creating a supervisory union structure from a supervisory district structure.
It becomes an alternative district.
Well, but I don't think you could start with an SD and then morph it into an SU to gain the benefits of both. But you could, by creating a new red, get the tax incentives other than the 10 cents. You can get the 8642 instead of the 108642, and get those benefits and get the $20,000 grant money to do the research and the transition money, that the red would afford you, right? And still be part of an alternative SU structure and still get some tax benefits. You would just miss the 10-cent piece of it, as opposed, but you would still get the 8642 piece of it, and accomplish partly what you want. and still get some benefits.
I think that's a good point. And in my mind, that's at the heart of the discussion we need to have tonight, is that there's not that much difference between the preferred structure, the tax benefits, and the red benefits. There's a 2-cent, 1-year difference. And so the key question in my mind is, it's not worth making the choice based on that 2 cents. We're committing to the structure for our existence. We're giving up all kinds of things, and we may be gaining other things. But the question is, what are we giving up and what are we gaining in doing that? I mean, the 2 cents to make this change just for that 2-cent incentive, I think is penny wise and pound foolish. I mean, it's 1 year. And so if that's why we're making the choice, I think that's probably not a very good reason to make the choice. I've heard a lot of, and I know that red formation is dependent on some other things too, but if that can happen. In our BRSU meetings and the governance structure meetings, there have been a lot of reasons thrown around that I've heard to not do this, to maintain the BRSU, including the investment we all have in it, and the progress we've made as a SU, but also the fact that we would be leaving out all the smaller districts and leave them to find another SU. But we haven't had a lot of discussion about what we actually gain by forming this preferred structure, except for that 2 cents, that 1 year of extra 2-cent tax discount.
Just a thought with that, because when we're talking about pros and cons, it's really from what you're saying right now. The comparison is really the preferred version. It's the SD versus the SU. So what do we pick up other than the 1 year of incentives for going the SD route instead of the SU route?
Right. What does that gain us aside from that 1 extra year of tax incentives?
Right.
I mean, to me, that's certainly not.
So it's not just generally what do we get from an SD. It's what do we get from an SD that we don't.
Versus maintaining an alternative structure and maintaining the BRSU.
John. I have 2 questions about the preferred structure. One is there anything in the law that would prevent us from collaborating with other schools even if we became our own supervisory district and supervisory union? No. So that things like special ed, we could still share the costs among schools outside of the structure we formed.
Yeah, I was with you up until you mentioned special ed.
Well, that's the gorilla in the room on that one.
Well, this is where you get into, you can say what the law says now and probably where the law is going to need to change. So for instance, currently, we just went through under Act 153 and then 156, a requirement that special ed be centralized at the supervisory union level.
Right.
Okay. SDs are supervisory unions under the law. So when you read those sections of the law, it says SD or SU. So you're going to have, in the case of an SD, all employees are employees. Or the SD is the only district, so they're all employees. But there's places in the law where it talks about, in particularly Act 153 and 156, it talks about SUs working together to contract, share things more, and that was encouraged under 153, sort of as an approach to short of governance change. But I would say nothing would prevent, there's nothing in the law that would prevent SDs from contracting with each other for services, and essentially the way the law is written now, it talks about SUs doing that. So for all intents and purposes, SDs are SUs for that section of the law. So I would think it's certainly, if there's some barrier in there that I'm not aware of, they would fix that in a second if that was inhibiting people from working together.
Okay, and something else that will hit close to home for you. Currently, you are employed by the BRSU.
That's correct.
So if we formed our own supervisory union, where do you go?
District or union?
Both, because the supervisory district is its own supervisory union.
Right. So, myself, other administrators, we work on in our own individual employment contracts. It would be hard, I think, for you to, say I had a 7-year contract and you were going to do this governance change in the middle. That's something we probably have to work out. So you want to be cognizant, I would think, as you start to understand what you might want to do, you want to make sure your employment contracts are in sync with that. Very similar to what we do with collective bargaining with other issues. If we know something's on the horizon, we limit our contracting exposure, because there's going to be a change.
But if the BRSU is dissolved as an entity because we form a new one, then you would become employed by one or other of the new structures?
You would want to make sure my current contract expired with the change, and then whether you chose to hire me or someone else. The main point I make is you wouldn't want to have a contractual obligation with an employee that transcended the time change when the entity dissolved.
Okay.
I think the key thing is there would be now two separate
superintendents.
We'd have two superintendents.
Yeah.
It would be one or the other, but not
Right,
both.
right.
We'd have new business office, we would have new special ed office. We would
Woohoo,
have
cost savings.
Yeah.
right.
I was, John, if I
Yeah,
can
you want to say
just
something.
back to the point David was making, sort of at the higher level, I think under the law, what's anticipated under Act 46 at some point is that the state board's going to merge some stuff at the end, at 2019. That part of the process to me isn't clear yet as to, I don't know if they have the authority to merge districts.
The rest is all clear, but that part's...
Yeah. So right now, the state board is very clear, has the authority, and they do control the composition of supervisory unions. Okay, so local districts can petition a change in supervisory unions, exactly what this district did, Winhall did. The state board ultimately controls, though, the composition of supervisory unions. Not sure the state board currently has the authority, or the AOE, to merge districts. So when this is all said and done, if there's districts laying on the table, I'm not sure currently they have the authority to merge them. Now, it suggests that the Secretary of Education is going to come up with a plan. The state board's going to, after a public comment period, come up with a plan. That plan might just be creating alternative governance structures or other SUs out of the parts. My point being, based on what David and Artie were saying, that that one of the differences between an SD and an SU in terms of the choice, other than the 2 cents, is perhaps controlling your destiny a little stronger through this time of turbulence. If you remain as an SU, perhaps you're exposing the organization to the ability of the state board to add districts to it that are laying around after the dust settles in 2019. Okay? Versus an SD, if the SD is composed of a certain size and strength, that you might be able to, part of the initial rationale for doing that is to really have a sustainable governance structure that's able to direct and be accountable for the outcomes for kids. To me, you'd want to preserve that. If you're going to do this, that is one of the policy objectives of Act 46. So to set yourself up for possible dissolution or dilution of that authority based on the parts that are laying around you might be a consideration. I think that's sort of the other point I'd make is, as you know, you have to be attentive to what your neighbors are doing. It's not just the BRCU districts, but what everyone else is doing around us as this goes forward.
Right.
But there are some considerations, I think, along those lines. So, for instance, the case of Winhall being a non-operating district, that could easily be incorporated into the alternative governance structure. At the end of 2019, if there's other non-operating districts in the region, the state board's probably going to say, well, there's a non-operating right there in that SU, let's just add those in. That would be very easy for them to do. So you just want to think about those things. I think that's a key difference between the SD and the SU models.
Yeah, Wendell.
A thought popped into my head a minute ago with the questions of where would the current superintendent go and whatnot. I don't know if it's ever been done, but I don't think we know how this works out. Well, let's just hypothetically say that the three of us formed an SD, and probably we would have to have a superintendent. Bennington Rutland would still exist in some fragments, which needs a superintendent. But I'm not sure there's anything in the law that I know of that says that two supervisory unions can't share a superintendent. I don't know if it's ever been done, but I mean, I think any combination and possibility that one can imagine right now is on the table unless there's something in the law that very specifically prohibits it.
You have to have a superintendent, but I would think that's back to Brian's question. Nothing, I don't think, to prevent you from contracting for services. You could certainly share them. I would just argue you're probably not going to have a sustainable governance structure in that scenario that's attractive to qualified candidates.
Yeah. To Wendell, directly to that point, if we do go through with that setting up a supervisory district, I don't think the BRSU could survive because you need 1,700 students for a supervisory union?
Yeah,
for the alternative?
Yeah, it's a point.
So that would probably dissolve.
Well, they could be augmented with other districts in the region. They'd be They'd be in a supervisory
You got to
unit.
reach pretty far to
Yeah.
get 1,700 when you take Flood Brook, MEMS, and Dorset.
It's 1,100.
Pardon me, 11. You
Yeah.
still have to reach pretty far. The other point that I want to make up that I'm just trying to go, what's the benefits of forming a supervisory district versus what's the drawbacks? John, you mentioned 2 cents for a year. It's actually 10 cents for 1 year. But I still don't think that's valid
Right. Yeah, you're right.
for making a decision of this magnitude.
Right.
The control of who comes in or out, i.e. the state could force districts into a union, but most likely, at least as it stands now, can't force a district into another district. Right? Is that,
Right, I
that's
mean,
what you said?
as you know, the voters really have that control, so it would require, let's say, for example, there's another district that was going to be added to the SD, the state really desired that, it would require a vote of both districts to essentially merge and create a new district. So that's a pretty significant legal barrier.
The other thing that hasn't been mentioned is representation.
Right.
The board structure of a school district is significantly different than the board structure of a supervisory union.
Correct.
School district, and even this is a little gray if I'm not mistaken, tends to be proportional.
Has to be some way or another.
Has to be some way or another. And it could be that if we form a school district, there's 3 people on the board, but each of them gets a percentage based on population. It could be a larger board, and that would be made up of various people from those towns. Could be all sorts of different things, I guess. A supervisory union, on the other hand, you get 3 seats on the board, regardless of size, so long as you have a school.
Operating school.
An operating school in that, but in that school district. So under the alternative supervisory union, if you need to have as few school districts as practicable. So you could still put us into one school district within the supervisory union, similar to what Artie was saying. And then you spelled out a scenario where maybe Medway, Courier, and Sunderland would be another school district. Let's just take that example. Our district and that other district would have equal say on a board, yet we'd be representing, I don't have the numbers in front of me exactly, but we'd be representing
over half.
Well over half. Probably closer to 65%, maybe 70%. Yet the votes would be equal, so to speak. That is just something to consider.
Is that board structure set in law? I thought Act 46 gave a lot more leeway as to how new boards could be structured.
Yeah, we're talking 2 different things. One is the board, the other is the supervisory union structure and the alternative government structure. So the board structure of a new district, that's one of the study committee items that has to be addressed. You know, you have to, when the study committee is formed, it has a list of 10 things under this section 706 it has to answer to the state. One of them is what's your model of representation? And one of the base rules of that is it can't violate the Constitution of one person, one vote. That's that proportional idea. Supervisory union composition, on the other hand, in the law is still set in the law. It hasn't been modified by Act 46 as far as I know. And that would come into play under the alternative governance structure, which would be a supervisory union. So I believe that that section of the statute still says 3 votes if you operate, 1 if you don't, and then there's like a third option that says, or some other methodology mutually agreeable.
Oh, okay, so there is wiggle room on that.
I think
the
that's
state board
still
has to approve that some other option, I think.
They do, yes, that's true. And there's been, in our region, there's been some interaction with the state board on this issue over time. SVSU has brought to the state board a couple times other approaches. So I know, there's probably some standard on that.
Okay, and just to finish my points, the drawbacks of forming an SD versus sort of recreating the BRSU in one way, shape, or form with the alternative structure, we would certainly narrow our breadth of students. There's a certain amount of, just decrease population, but a certain amount of diversity that we have in the BRSU that might be lost in a narrower SD. Also, the special ed was mentioned, and that is something that should be present on our mind. If for no other reason, it's a significant part of our budgets, and it's in flux, as you said. Just moved from our school districts up to the supervisory union. I've heard talk. I don't know if it's going to happen, but moving up to the state from the supervisory union level, but who knows if that's ever going to happen. but also the complexity. The BRSU as it stands is a very complex structure, right?
Right.
By recreating that, we do run the risk of potentially making an even more complex structure. So there's something to be said for the simplicity of just a school district with these 3 schools. And those are the issues that I see are pertinent to the discussion. I'm off my soapbox.
Question for clarification. If we were to go with a preferred structure and form our own school district, there's nothing in the law that mandates representation on that school district board as far as residency requirements for each of the towns to create any sort of proportionality on that board. Am I correct? So if Dorset, Mountain Towns Red, and Manchester are one school district, then it's however many representatives from that school district. And they could all come from Dorset, they could all come from Mountain Towns Red area, or they could all come from Manchester.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on this, but I believe, you know, you have to answer this question to the satisfaction of the law and the state board. And so it gets into constitutional issues. And I don't believe there's a requirement per se to make sure that every single town is represented, because you really have one big district boundary. Right. But it does have to be worked out somehow. And you know, you can think, I'm thinking of current SDs that we have, like Burlington, for instance. There are, you know, in cities you have wards. In those wards, like gerrymandering, those boundaries are drawn up to be proportional somehow. And then there's representatives
from each ward
based on a proportional basis.
So it can be done legally?
Yeah,
okay.
I think so. But that's new learning for me. We'd really have to check with the attorney on that.
Okay.
It sounds like Act 46 gives quite a bit of leeway as to how these boards are formed. But the other thing to remember is that whether we form the supervisory district or not, we're still likely to have to form a new district with a new board. So Manchester, Dorset, and the Mountain Towns Red are likely to form a new district, whether it's an SD or whether it's a combined district as part of the BRSU. So we're likely to have to form a new district board either way.
That's certainly, I think, my conclusion of reading Act 46, and that's one of the reasons I suggested these 3 boards get together. I can't imagine a scenario right now, unless the law changes, where you're not going to be confronted with merging. You know, you're under the least practical number of districts. You're the K-8 districts. You know, you have so much in common that it's hard for me to imagine an alternative governance structure where you would not be merged together, honestly.
Right. Yeah, so I think for our purposes tonight, I mean, I think it may or may not be true, but I think we ought to assume that we're going to merge either way. And the question is, and that may not be true, but if we do have to merge, does it make sense to merge and form an SD or merge and remain part of the BRSU? Wendell?
I agree that there's a likelihood that we're going to have to merge. Thus, before we can answer the question of how that is done, we really need to start thinking about what some of the advantages, yes, and disadvantages too, but I think it's easier to think of the disadvantages than the advantages right off the top of one's head. So it's going to be a difficult thing, I think, for a lot of people, and if there are really legitimate benefits of us merging and becoming one district, whether it's a supervisory district or simply a school district, we need to start thinking real carefully what advantages would there be to being such an entity. And without thinking through that, I'm not even sure we can make that other kind of a decision.
Right. And then the problem you run into, though, is that the time-sensitive decision is about forming an SD.
I know.
So that's a discussion we can have, I mean, we need to have, obviously, and is really the most important one. But at the same time, if we are not interested in forming an SD, then we have quite a lot more time to have these discussions.
But if we think we want to form an SD, it's still going to take voter approval.
Yes.
And I suggest we better have a pretty good selling way to get that approval. And I don't, maybe the tax incentives will do it, but I think I would feel a little derelict to do it just for that reason without myself having some sense of, okay, we formed, now what's going to happen?
Right.
I also think that the time pressure is fully there either way because we want to get the red incentives if we do an SU. So
right. But that gives us an extra.
We're under a lot of time pressure, whatever we decide.
There's also, as far as time
Yeah,
pressure.
for me, this, you know,
Sorry, John.
this, the longer-term educational outcomes are handcuffed to decisions we make tonight or in the next few months. And does Act 46 afford us the opportunity, you know, to enhance the nature of our schools or offer specialized programs or, you know, alternative programs? You know, that for me, thinking about those different opportunities we can offer and diversifying our programming, that's handcuffed to all these decisions. And you know, what are those possibilities? And I think those you know, possibilities have inherent fears tied to them too. But I think that's an honest conversation that we might could have.
Just support that comment, because I think that falls right into what Wendell was talking about, John's been talking about, that, you know, the true advantage of putting us together is we would be more likely to look at it as an education system and try to figure out how to improve education for, you know, all those students who are joined together. Right now, we're actually kind of hamstrung because we're separate schools, and I think we work pretty well together, but there are some limitations based on the fact we're different districts.
Yeah, I think it would require a real paradigm shift of, you know, currently we think of our kids as our kids in Manchester, for example, but we need to think of our kids as our kids and whoever we are.
I was going to say another factor as far as time pressure goes, it's a factor, but Dan pointed out at one of the BRSU meetings that the smaller towns in the SU sort of have to wait until we decide what we're going to do, right? Paraphrasing what you said, if we're going to form a school district, that leaves one path closed to Paulette, Rupert, Danby, Mount Tabor, and Sunderland. So part of the time pressure on us is to make sure that they have an appropriate amount of time to figure out their destiny as well. And that should be mentioned, if for no other reason. I see Sunderland, Danby just stepped out, you know, Winhall as well. So we do a little bit of consideration, I think, to our fellow citizens.
I think it's more than just time pressure. It's also pressure on choice, because that is an option.
Thank you. You're right.
Either we could change our choice, smaller towns can change their choice, but that's also part of the pressure. That's the state's trying to change that.
Yeah, good point.
I just wanted, as a smaller town, to speak to that. What we've been tasked with is deciding the choice issue. If you were to combine, we would then have one option of choosing your governance structure as our governance structure, and choosing one possibility would be for us to choose to join you as an option.
And that's not the only possibility.
No, it's not the only possibility, but what I'm saying is if this is your choice, the reason it's a time constraint for us is because if it's your choice to do that, then we have another option available to us to choose.
Yeah, I think it does shift the conversation in the other districts. I was going to, I like your characterization that you have this sort of tension. I think that both Wendell represents the one piece, and you brought it back. The two issues are related. You know, you have this timeliness of the incentives that you can't ignore, but it's certainly not expecting to make a decision based on just the incentives. You have this other aspect, and what I was envisioning, what I was hoping tonight just to hear from you all was there a real attractiveness to 10 cents versus 8 cents. You know. And that might be present in some communities. You know, that's really, above all else, that's what we need to do. I wasn't expecting you to be able to ignore the other aspects. And what I was thinking in my mind is that I know, I like to joke, the purpose of a meeting is to schedule future meetings, right? But I was going to suggest that the next conversation of this group would be to vet the law through the policy objectives, to examine this organization through the policy objectives of this law. There's 3 policy objectives in the law: efficiency, equity of opportunity, and sustainable governance structure. and to have you work through your knowledge of the BRSU system to see what structure you feel, based on your understanding of incentives and all the other possibilities, what structure would be the place where you'd want to go in terms of being in alignment with what appears to be the very clear policy objectives of the state of Vermont in terms of its public education system. So, you want to get in alignment with those as best as possible. Which of these governance structures might allow you to do that? And that conversation would flesh out some of the equity, quality issues. I think the sustainable governance piece is part of it, certainly part of the objective of the state. So you've had some of that conversation tonight. But the issue of efficiency is also one that has to be discussed quite a bit. And what we're seeing now in places in the state, if you follow some of the other conversations in Act 46, I am impressed by some of the numbers that are coming out in terms of projected savings, which based on my own analysis, I haven't seen savings of that magnitude short of closing a school. So, when we did the merger here, let's say the merger here including the formation of the Mountain Towns Red and its movement with Winhall to the BRSU, part of the savings from the state perspective was the dissolution of the Windsor Southwest Supervisory. So my understanding is that saved the state about $300,000. So there's going to be opportunities for the state to dissolve some structures. Hopefully they won't be creating some new ones, or we won't be creating some new ones. But when I heard Elmore and Morrisville projecting savings well above $300,000 from a merger, so I'm really interested in what that looks like. So I don't expect the magnitude of savings to emerge from this conversation, because essentially we're talking about pulling everything under one roof. But still, the efficiency issue is one that we would want to look at, because I think there are some things we can do staffing-wise, otherwise, that probably will achieve some efficiency. But my disposition right now is to be kind of conservative on promising any kind of efficiency on this approach. But anyway, for the future conversation, I was going to plan to kind of walk you through that other side of the law. I think what I'm hearing tonight is no one's totally enamored with the 10 cents, so much so that this is like, woohoo, let's do it, But I think this issue of an SD or not, for me, comes in two flavors. One is, do you want to do it in sort of this one approach of forming your own district and pulling away from the SU, or converting the SU into an SD, which is then a different conversation. That's really saying to your neighbors, you're welcome to join us. The diversity issue would be part of that. You're welcome to join us, but you're going to have to change, because we have half the kids we're not going to change.
Well, even if we formed a red, they would have the option of changing and joining as part of that red to get the tax incentives as
That's
well,
correct.
and remain part of the BRSU.
Yeah, and I know under that structure, particularly Meadowy is probably not going to be interested in doing that, but they have the designation option. That's really going to be a tough one for them to untangle. But this is predicated on the idea that the state board is going to reaffirm what has been the opinion on choice, like we've been saying, that you can't have the different types of enrollment options in the same structure. Okay. So we'll know that mid-September or so. But I think the SD option needs to be talked about as inviting other people to join as well. And I know our districts are in different minds about that issue. But that's, tonight I was thinking that you would start to express some interest in SD or not, and then start to express some interest in talking with your neighbors about an SD or not. It's sort of exhausting that exhausts the SD option in my view. And then you're kind of back around on the incentive end to looking at the alternative governance structure.
Yeah, sure, Melanie.
If you were to join from a red right now, would that buy you the time to kind of flesh out what a red felt like in your district together, then to become an SD the following year, or an SU after figuring out what the configuration of the red is like? Does that make sense?
It would still be a 2-year process to form a red.
Right, but I see the opportunity of forming a red kind of prolonging the, I guess just giving you time to flesh out whether or not an SD versus an SU is a good fit for the region. And I don't know if that's even an option. I don't know if it's forming a red, takes away the option of an SD versus an SU, but it might just prolong it too. But it seems like an interesting way of kind of
it seems like we would run up against the state deadline. Yep.
Just to separate it, is probably Dan mostly, the Agency of Education did a little worksheet on, Act 46 criteria, accelerated mergers, and, go through this worksheet to see if you can, do the preferred structure in SD on an accelerated basis. And the thing that confused me is the second point in here, the first one is, do you have at least 900 ADM? Second point is, are all member districts in your SU part of the proposed merger? And then it says, if no, you are not eligible for the accelerated merger. That kind of, that actually, that surprised me, and if that were actually the case, that would kind of blow up our conversation here.
Yeah, that clearly says we can't do it.
Yeah, I'm just curious, is that something you're aware of or anything,
It's not my understanding of the law, but,
It's not mine either. That's why I was surprised it showed up here. Okay.
That could be their interpretation. There's going to be official interpretations that we're going to have to pay attention to. But I'm thinking some of the conversations Marty and I listened to the other day, I don't think that there was interest in merging every district in the SU, but it really wasn't about a disqualification.
Okay. So it doesn't really make sense. We should just clarify.
Yeah, it's a good point. We'll have to get clarification on that.
Yeah, well,
Dan suggested what the next meeting should be like, so perhaps we should have the next meeting. And before he said that, I was about to say probably the best thing we could do would be to decide to form a study committee. Having sat through the Red Study Committee, then you get a group of people there and you really brainstorm. And you throw things around every which way in a way that is difficult to do in a more formal meeting session, and figure out what this animal might actually look like.
Yeah, Dan brought up a point at our board meeting last night that maybe I think it's a great idea. We should probably call it an Act 46 committee to differentiate it from a study committee under 706 and all. It's the only, I think it's a great idea.
Do we need, as each of our boards, to finally decide as a board how we feel about this, or do we want to proceed with this?
Well, we can't do anything without considering it as a board. So, I mean, we could do it right now individually as boards, but the group of us together can't make any decisions about.
Right.
So I do think every board has to decide individually, but.
To what extent is that redundant to the BRSU Governance Committee?
Well, that's one question. I mean, that would allow for board members of each of our boards that are not on the BRSU board to be part of the committee rather than the BRSU Governance Committee. But it could also be a committee that's made up of only our three boards and not all the other members of the BRSU, if we wanted to just talk more about our three boards.
Does the committee,
but it is somewhat redundant.
Would that committee necessarily be restricted to just board members, or could we have members?
Definitely not.
So we could have community members from each of the three towns as well. So that would be one of the differences of the BRSU committee.
It also could be structured as an SU-wide study committee to form a supervisory district SU-wide. That may not in the end be really feasible, but that gets everybody at the table talking and brainstorming. People can pull away from it, they can decide not to participate, and the entity shrinks. But rather than start little and try to grow it, my own sense is we start big and see what the brainstorming can come to, because there's this thought out there, although I think Jeff has already said this is not the only option, but that, okay, we could join and everybody has to have our choice situation. On the other hand, we could join and we could create more choice, which fit with some other districts.
I agree with you. I think that's a great idea. I think a lot of these other districts that are smaller have a lot more to lose than we have nothing to lose. We're going to develop a model that works for us, and then they're going to decide if they want to join it, and they have things that they're giving up. And I think to be a part of the conversation from the beginning would be more productive for them. And I think we would hear a lot about what some of those other issues are that we maybe need to be more sensitive to. We make sense, so this is easy, let's do it. But I almost feel like we're abandoning the rest of our supervisory union. Perhaps we take the superintendent with us. I mean, it just seems like that there should be more voices at the table initially. And if you fall away, if you say, we're not giving up school choice yet, or we don't want to give up our independent school, or whatever, that you have that opportunity to say that early and not be playing catch up for the next 2 years, desperately trying to fall into one of these categories and have some control over your destiny. Get to the table earlier.
I think that the city committee idea is a great idea. If it does involve all the districts in the SU, then there's even more overlap with the existing governance committee. So the question is whether we just continue to have the governance committee meet and invite anybody from other boards, or whether we actually really need to form a different organization. I mean, we've already had board members from other boards come into the governance committee who aren't on the VRSU board, and that's worked well.
We can also sort of open up the, if people, based upon the targeted nature of the discussion, if people want to, change up who wants to be on the governance committee, kind of open it up. That could be the entity we use, but just make it much more free form.
Yeah.
That could make a lot of sense.
The other, just to sort of continue the discussion a little bit about the SD, since that really, again, is sort of like the heart of what I think Dan is looking for tonight. I've been trying to sort of summarize what people have brought up here in terms of reasons why we might want an SD versus an alternative SU. And I'm curious to hear if anybody has other things in mind, or because we haven't honestly come up with very much. There's the 10-cent tax incentive. So there's that 1 year of extra 10-cent tax incentive. There's possibly, Dan brought up the fact that perhaps we control our destiny to a greater extent by maybe the state not merging other districts in with us. Is that a fair summary of what you were saying?
Yeah.
There's that perhaps we, and again, this is all open to interpretation too, but there's some question about the SU board makeup and whether we would be represented on the SU board by, proportionally or not. And that's it. So that's, I haven't really, I don't think, unless I'm missing any points that other people have brought up about reasons why we might want to do an SD instead of an SU.
John, I think you ought to, as part of your thinking early on, is do a financial analysis of what it would cost to run an SD made up of your 3 districts, because to set up and operate a central office is no mean feat. And it may cost you a lot more than 10 cents on tax. 10 cents would get you.
1 year.
10 cents is 1 year, and the central office is forever.
Right. Yeah, that's the big, that's the elephant in the room, that we don't really have any. So I guess the question is, and I think this is guidance you're looking for from us, I know it is, but it says it in the memo, do we want to move ahead with having a financial model of this? Is there enough reason for us to do it that we want to see it modeled? Is that right?
Yeah, what I couch is as to what extent do the boards want to study, so our next, we need some tasking from the boards, and this is kind of in the back of my mind as you were debating which committees are going to do what. We have limited capacity to do some studying for you. We can do some really good studying for you, I think better than an external party. But to me, the SD question hinges on, do you want to do an SD, the 3 of you, do you want to do an SD, the 3 of you, with others added on? It's sort of, to me, that's the rub of the SD question. I haven't heard a lot about interest in the 3 of you going off and doing an SD. I don't know if that's fair takeaway from my end, but if I was saying in terms of what we should study, if you wanted to study the SD with everyone being invited to join, and at least start a get the conversation started with the member boards to what extent they'd be interested in that. And we could wrap that end up pretty quickly in September, in a couple weeks here, to at least understand if that's what we should study as an SU. And if there's no interest in that and we're back to the alternative, we could report back and say, it looks like the alternative, these other districts aren't going to want to do that, they want the alternative.
Question for you, Dan. if the decision was to form an SD and invite the other districts to join, because an SD is essentially an SU, does the state have the ability to compel a non-interested district in joining?
I don't think they have the authority right now.
Okay.
The composition of SUs, that part of the statute deals with a traditional SU. It doesn't deal with the SD aspect.
So the odds are, in looking at the current makeup of the BRSU, if any town were to say no, they're not interested in joining the SD because they don't want to give up choice or for whatever reason, odds are our costs will actually go up because we wouldn't have another district to share them with.
Yeah, I think that's a key variable is getting the economy of scale. I think the numbers that are in the law come sort of are from research but scaled down for the Vermont perspective. Nationally, we know the most efficient district seems to be around 1,500 kids. In Vermont, we brought that down to 900 for this law, 1,100 for the alternative governance structure.
But unless we're inviting a district that's not currently a BRSU member, we're not going to gain any economies of scale.
Yeah, other than you might be able to eliminate some positions that are necessary due to the supervision and the spread of the organization. But that would have to be analyzed.
Do you, off the top of your head?
I'm not going to speculate yet, but
okay.
I'd be interested in studying that. That's what I'm kind of looking for as direction, is how to put this together for you.
So we have potentially overhead in the BRSU that would not be necessary as an SD.
Yes.
But also the number of board meetings that you have to attend.
That's a whole other factor.
I mean, maybe not quantifiable.
That falls into that sustainable governance structure issue, but just on the efficiency piece.
Right.
Yes,
so
we
might make you more efficient.
We have the ability. Right now, we have to supervise so many different entities from a financial perspective.
Sure.
We talk almost daily lately about our inability to spend federal money because we have all these silos and not all of them are in alignment. So our ability to really leverage those funds, which isn't necessarily efficiency, but it is being more effective in our use of federal monies. So there's a number of factors like that. Having one payroll versus 7. One audit versus 11. There's things like that that would, on a smaller scale.
At the margin.
Yeah, absolutely.
Melanie?
I don't know if you kind of clarified who you would include in this one district. I mean, I might be wrong, and I'm obviously not representing you, but the number of boards that don't operate a school and are going to Granville and going to places that are just seem unreasonable to get them down to the Manchester, Dorset area. I'd be surprised if any of them would be willing to even be part of that SD and forcing their kids to travel. So I don't know if you would want to think about ruling them out, when looking at who you're going to put together with your financial study.
My thinking, they would not be forced to travel here. I think there's a couple ways, and we're talking about I call it the Medowee area, which is Paulton and Rupert. Essentially, this SD, if the enrollment option were to stay the same, would have choice 9 through 12. So the first thing is, all those people, they would have choice in New York High School. Challenge for them is the New York high schools are significantly less expensive than the Vermont high schools because New York subsidizes their schools to a greater extent than Vermont. So they'd be looking at potentially increased costs of, like BBA, for instance, is more expensive than Granville or Salem. But then the issue comes up of where they would go in grades 7 and 8. And technically the SD would be operating schools K through 8, so they would be required to attend a school that is operated by the district. We currently don't operate a school those grade levels in that region, and it is too far away for them to come here. I am thinking there's a mechanism in the law about geography. If children live on the edge of a district and there's a town with a school closer by, it gives the board the authority to let them go across the boundary into that other district. I'm thinking there's authority probably in the law currently to allow those students to attend New York State schools and not have to attend a district-operated school at grades 7 and 8. So I certainly would expect them to be compelled to travel down to this region.
Isn't there a mechanism that you can designate more than one high school?
High schools,
Steve,
yes.
sorry, you can't hear you.
I'm sorry. I think there's a mechanism within Act 46 that you can designate up to 3 high schools.
That's correct.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, we're at designation. So in that instance, essentially BBA would have to be interested in designation, in terms of including Salem and Granville in a 3 high school designation scheme.
That's one option,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
we could, Paul and Rupert would have to say, pick Granville or Salem, and then that would be another designation. Right?
Yeah.
That would be an option.
Right.
Okay.
Yep. And there's an escape clause under designation in the law that allows parents to go elsewhere, but it becomes a little more forceful and limits choice to a certain extent.
We've been talking for over an hour 15, and there's nothing about education on your pro list. I think we should put something there.
What did you say?
Well, kids? He said that we've been talking for an hour and 15 minutes, and there's nothing about education on our pro list. And this is what, Wendell and John brought up too. And I think the tricky thing about that is I think we all agree that's the most important thing. Mm-hmm. But I also don't think that we're going to get the same results whether we merge our 3 districts to form an SD or we merge our 3 districts to form a big district, a red district. So I think we all agree that's the most important conversation to have, but I think it's a different question than whether there's advantages to an SD over a red. I mean, we're still forming a new district. We still function the same as that new district. So I don't disagree at all that that's the most important thing, but at the same time, I think it's a different question. Not the one that we came tonight really to hash out. Yep.
Some of us have been in discussions, sort of really preliminary about what possible things and how we could have, enhanced extracurricular arts, drama, music, and orchestra, all of those things, more distance learning. We met once at the SU and talked about all these options that we might consider, except the roadblock was just that we were all separate districts, and the logistics and the funding of all that was too complicated. The other idea that we've talked about on the Flood Brook, on a red board, is the idea of someday having a larger middle school, a middle school that would encompass all of our districts, because our middle schools are getting smaller and we can't offer as much opportunity to our kids. So there are lots of possible benefits to kids. I mean, you're right, that should be our paramount objective. But we have begun those talks, and people had lots of good ideas.
And this is part of the reason I think that sooner rather than later, if we're going to do anything, we need to form official study committees, which, yes, probably will be some school board members, but there's going to be more of a mix of people. And as school board members, we're locked in to a degree in a certain frame of reference. And if we get community members that are not in our frame of reference, that's when ideas begin to fall around and see what gels out of them. And I might not be as aware of that, but because I was on the Red Study Committee and after a couple of months ended up by circumstances chairing it, I realized that school board representation, but also people with all kinds of different perspectives, getting into a room and hashing this over has a lot of merit.
I just, sorry, I think, community engagement and community involvement are going to be really key. I just wonder do you think it makes sense, first, I guess to some extent, I think, we need to narrow down the option, what we think makes sense. We have to, do some of the homework ourselves and kind of figure out, financially what makes sense. We have to have some of the answers before we're prepared to, otherwise, if we get the community involved and we can't answer their questions, we're not.
Not the whole community.
Yeah.
A group, an official study committee, which is not just made up of school board members. Right. Those questions
but when it gets,
will have to be answered. Yes.
Brainstorming sessions are good, but if you create a committee and it's too big, then it's not going to get anything accomplished either.
Well, it can't be too big, yeah. But it needs a variety of inputs.
I think we definitely need something. It's just, what it looks like and to make it functional. That's a harder question, I think.
John Wilson.
Yeah, just for my point, just to connect with what was just said. Your name again? I'm sorry.
Jim.
Jim. In looking at what Maine did a few years ago in their consolidation effort, it looked like one popular approach, not to say I'm advocating for this, but is to form various subcommittees with specific threads of study, whether that be, cost savings or, educational outcomes. But to go back to what I was originally going to say, the tension with my first comment, it seems like that, Dan, you were saying if we were to pursue, if we really wanted to study, then we could, you guys could study what would the real cost savings be as far as overhead and how we could leverage these grants. And that, that could give us a better understanding of these, other educational opportunities that might be available to us. And so, yeah, is that basically what you're saying? If we ask you to study this, you can give us a good sense of the savings and the grants that could be leveraged and the scale we might gain, and if so, then why not pursue that?
Yeah, no, that's kind of, as I said to some of you, my thinking from a leadership perspective was that we would spend the summer educating ourselves about Act 46, and we're arriving at that point now. I think where the leadership forum for me was sort of that turning point where we start to apply the law. And I think a key part of that is for us to put some meat on the bones on some of these ideas, both financially and governance-wise and educationally. The organization is a sprawling organization, so you have, tonight you can see, the complexity in front of you and the ability to have committees just among the three of you is daunting to me. And we have 7, or what is it, 3, I can add them up here. We have 8 other boards that aren't here tonight, okay? So we have interest among some of them to form interstate school districts under this law. We have some who want to go out and form non-operating districts with other districts and other SUs. So there's a lot of things that we're going to be able to support and study. So what I'm trying to do is figure out where we could most benefit most people by putting our time on it. No doubt it will be an SD and an alternative governance structure of some flavor. So I was just trying to get a sense of, so if we do the SD, you want 4 variations of that. You want one with a 3, you want one with a 3 plus 1, 1 plus a 3 plus 2, one with a 3 plus every 1, and you want the alternative done this way, that way, this way. And that's fine, but what's going to happen time-wise, in spite of our best intentions, is this is all going to happen during the budget season, which is just about to start now with the special ed service plan process. That's why VSBIT, VSBA are rolling out support services for this kind of work. So not to belabor the point, but there's no help out there really to help us do this. If you hire someone to do that, the first thing you're going to do is ask my staff the answers to the questions, okay? So, that's why I'm just trying to keep pushing you along to find out where are those couple of cases where it would make sense for us to make the most bang for our buck, because ultimately you're going to have to do community engagement. And the way this law is set up, it's going to fall to each of your boards individually to do that. You could envision a community engagement process with all of you up here and all of your 3 communities in the room, but I don't think that's going to be very effective. You're going to have to do individual community engagement. Each board's going to have to make its own decision. We're trying to coordinate that among a group of you. But I think, that case analysis is going to be helpful if it's got some detail to it. And we only can go so far, if we have multiple things to study. So it's kind of the rub of it.
Just a kind of a question that, in doing the analysis, yeah, we don't want to overwhelm our resources, but at the same time, for something like the SD versus SU, it can probably be a much more simplified analysis than, so there are different levels of analysis. I think the SD-SU would be a very, a relatively quick and dirty, because we're not going to know all the answers, but it's going to be, sort of a decent best guess, so that we have something to go with. I don't think we want to use a ton of resources, on that. We want an initial indication.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I think, we've talked internally just briefly among ourselves. I mean, on this issue of capacity and our ability to serve you, one of the things that could be potentially the biggest draw of our time is to untangle what we've built. Okay, so if you want certain districts to go, say we're going to unpack the special ed model we built, just untangling things is going to be a big job, and that we found that with the red, when we had to put the red together, it was sort of going back to the organic town school districts to sort of figure out what their financial state was before we brought it together in a single model. So we have to, taking things apart and putting it back together is a really labor-intensive process.
Actually, that's a very important point to note in the whole thing. And, part of, like David said earlier, it's like, on the savings side, people think, okay, consolidating, we're going to save a lot of money. And, I'll pretty much guarantee, even those people coming up with huge numbers of savings, that's not going to happen in year one. That's sort of the long-term goal. And you're probably talking about spending more money when you make these changes initially to implement the changes. So you're not going to look like heroes in year one or necessarily even year two. Hopefully savings will come down the road, but it's a complex process to create change.
The problem too is you're not going to look like heroes either way, because even if there are savings, your taxes are still going to go up. There's going to be no reflection in the tax increase of your savings. So you've been quiet and wanted to say something.
So I think, after about an hour and a half, it's kind of, the picture is coming clear on the objectives that everybody wants to achieve. But as Dan was asking, we still have, some other districts that are out there, and it would be really important for us to know what direction they're thinking before we start to say we want to look at a governance structure that's 3+1 or 3+2. They're K to 6. Now they have 7 and 8 to worry about. What's their intent? They've been pretty quiet all along, and I think you might have. Well, I mean, I think we can understand.
They've been having their own conversations.
You tried to, politely not get involved in that one at the beginning of the meeting. But I think we really need to know what's going to happen. What do they want to do? Is Paul looking to, look to New York, or look to kind of the Rutland area, going north?
And we'll have a sense that Jim, as his capacity as the SU chair, is going to come to all the September board meetings to listen in on that. Paulett, Rupert, and Medowee have agreed to hold a joint school board meeting coming up on the 10th of September, so they're going to meet as a group. And I know we just met with Sunderland the other night, and Courier's coming up, so we'll keep working on these issues. And they're not quiet in my mind. I mean, they definitely have perspectives and views on what they think about these things, but they're, once again, I think no matter how we diced it, a lot hinged on what this conversation was going to look like, because in some ways they have to react to that,
Yeah, but I don't know that we could tonight recommend that you go and do a 3+1 or a 3+2.
No, I wasn't thinking tonight. What I wanted to hear tonight, honestly, was, is there some interest in going off on your own? Firstly, I haven't really heard that yet. But that very well, we should have that open conversation.
Or doing it with a 10-cent tax advantage.
Yeah, or even if you added others, but just to go off on your own. The idea that if you're not interested in others joining you, whether it be for an alternative or an SD, it doesn't sound like people have set views on that either. So, I mean, that in itself is useful conversation for me tonight.
I think at the BRSU board meeting and at the governance committee meetings, the thing that, we always seem to come back to the same item. Before we make decisions, we need some idea of the financial side of it. So, that's where, we're kind of, if we're not, everybody's not clamoring for an SD write-off, I think, we need some quick and dirty financial analysis that gives us an idea of what that means, because we're going to, we're just to feel that we're doing our due diligence and to be able to also, respond to questions we're invariably going to get about it. We need a bit of info, a little bit more to come to any conclusions. But I don't imagine that it makes sense to use a lot of resources in trying to develop that. It should be, a not a terribly detailed analysis.
First, Ronnie wants to speak, Stephen wants to speak. Go ahead.
I just have 2 points. Number one, I think from a cost savings perspective, the BRSU has already done a fairly decent job of consolidate with some of our cost benefits. And I think that's part of the reason we're not going to see as much of a savings as some other areas of the state may. We've done consolidation of special ed, we've done a lot of other low-hanging fruit already as BRSU. I think that is one of the things that isn't going to generate a huge cost savings in our particular situation. The other thing I will say is from the smaller district's perspective, the resources being limited to BRSU's support, the more you use up, the less is available for us to figure out what we're doing. So I would just caution you on the side of being supportive of the rest of us. If you can do limited until you know what you're most interested in, that would probably be helpful.
Stephen and then Mark. Mark.
Yep. Having done 2 consolidation studies and done several workshops, having participated in several workshops on, having to do these kinds of things, the only advice I can give you is no matter how you make your own group up, to study this, that answer only the questions you're prepared to answer. You have the answers too. So if you're going to do a financial analysis, only do the financial analysis of the question you can answer, which is, what would it look like if the 3 of you joined? Because you really won't know what the other districts will do until they vote. The boards can tell you anything they want, but in the first and second round of the consolidations under 153 and 156, there's been more than one study that's been fooled. At the very end of the vote, when some districts said no, that they expected to say yes for some political reason that happened the week before. So the only answer you could really have is what will the financial impact be if the 3 of you create an SD? And that's the only thing you really know. And the other thing is, whatever your study group is, have it very focused. Have a very clear set of directions. Make sure it's not amorphous. If it's going to be, what does it look like to do an SD or an SU? Make sure it's very clear as to what those things mean, and not all kinds of things. Well, what if we're 3 districts or 4 districts or 6 districts or whatever? Make sure it's very, very clear. And make sure make sure everything is very focused. Otherwise, it'll take you forever to go nowhere.
Well, I'm glad I waited. That's great input. I guess just picking up, I hate being at a meeting for 2 hours and walking away and having nothing accomplished. So
I have a suggestion. Go ahead.
As far as forming a committee, it does not have to be under the auspices of a board. I mean, we could have a multi-town committee that doesn't follow the board rules, correct, Dave?
Well, do you think the governance committee is a good base?
Not more than a quorum of any one board is there.
It's a community group of some sort.
Right. So we could lay the foundation to set up a study committee, and whether there's board members on it or not. But as John said, there can't be a quorum. Do we run afoul of the BRSU quorum issues? Probably not, because the quorum would be so. We wouldn't attain the number, right?
Yeah, I lost you there for a minute. I mean, it sounded like you were advocating for some sort of informal group, like a community-based group that wasn't really affiliated with any board.
Correct.
Yeah.
But if, like, the 5 Manchester
if
board members showed up, then that might be an issue.
Yeah.
But if
the BRSU,
we wouldn't run any reserves. So I think we can set up a committee, a multi-town committee. I think we can, and we still have time to actually get to that. So as far as giving you more direction or insight, I think what I heard you say earlier is, would you like as broad a possible of a financial study or as narrow a possible of a financial study? Did I hear that correctly from you?
well, I think we're just going to have to be cognizant of the time factor and what else is going on. I agree with sort of Jim's characterization that there can be levels of analysis. We can go to a certain place and say, okay, that's not a good option. But honestly, these analyses, you pretty much already understand the nuts and bolts of what we're talking about. They're not going to reveal something you don't already kind of know instinctively as what's going to happen.
Right, but when we go back to our respective towns,
right,
we should have some
facts, absolutely.
Something too hard to go back with.
Yeah, absolutely.
So my next question is a procedural one. Can we break off into our respective town boards and give you some sort of feedback from a town-by-town basis?
Sure. I mean, I have a suggestion.
Okay. And then maybe the 3 towns could give you, yes, we want just a narrow focus study, and then that would. Now, my next question before you go is, what would you prefer? What kind of study would you prefer? As broad or as narrow as possible?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, I'd just like to, once again, I think this has been productive for me in terms of hearing there isn't a strong inclination to break away, there isn't a strong inclination to keep people out, those, just testing the ground on some of those ideas. Not to say you don't go there later on, but, my trajectory is still by that leadership forum date on September 17th, that people feel pretty comfortable with Act 46. They understand what's in it, you've tried on a few things, you understand what the tensions are in it. If we can get to September 17th and be in that place, I feel good. The trick is then going to be to transition to the next part, which is the actual application of the law. And there's going to be, because the law says it's an individual district decision, there's going to be a tension between doing that and our ability to leverage a common systems sort of response to coming up with a template of numbers that everyone can use, that kind of stuff. So, from my perspective at this point, I feel, my interpretation's wrong, and I'm hearing nothing tonight that's a strong inclination to go off on your own and do anything. I don't hear anything tonight that says we don't want to include others in the conversation. So that's good to just check those 2 boxes from my perspective. I think at some point, no doubt, we'll be doing some level of financial analysis and other modeling and educational analysis of either the SD and the alternative governance structure, just to put some meat on the bones of both of those proposals. Those are basically the 2 options in the law, so why wouldn't we model out versions of both of them to a certain extent?
So you have the information you need, is what you just said.
Yeah, I mean, I can start to move forward with that. I'm just wondering, last night at Dorset board wants to speak, they're anticipating doing a public engagement process in their own community. So that gets to the point where, we're talking about the end of October, start to planning on what kinds of things should be at their fingertips to put some specificity on the different options. If people were to ask, well, what are the tax implications other than penalty? What does that start to look like as a system? So we can have some documents that are useful for that type of process. To me, that's sort of, in terms of analysis, that's the purpose of the analysis at this point, is to serve public engagement. So it's not debatable. It sort of informs people's deliberations on what's involved, so they can understand what it looks like. How does our tax rate be determined? What does that look like? What's involved in the voting on the budgets? That kind of stuff.
And appropriately to, I can't remember your name, and I apologize, concern, and that's not going to suck up an inordinate amount?
No, I think it's all related as we're doing that. I mean, it's the same part of the approach that's going to need to be done for them anyway. It gets a little more complicated with the current union districts, because they're essentially the ones, they don't get to vote on it. Their town school districts vote on it. So there's going to be a certain amount of engagement around talking with the current union district has to be dissolved. Right. As part of, there's a little twist there that we have to work with.
One thing that I noticed tonight in just talking through all this is that if we think about our districts merging either way, assume for a second that happens, and then assume, and I know this is a long shot, but that Courier and Sunderland both decide they want to be part of that district because either they get the red incentives or they join the SD and get those incentives. So they're going to change their choice. So all of a sudden there's not too much left.
That's right.
There's Paulette, which you think maybe could have a different situation because of geographic isolation, and there's Winhall, who's the true anomaly.
Yeah.
So Winhall is really the only one that doesn't fit into the model, whether it be an SD or an alternative SU.
Yeah, I mean, that's, when I look at it, you're not too far away from an SD with the current structure, Granted, it puts those other districts in it, like I said, it really puts them in a different conversation. I mean, instead of sitting there looking at all the possibilities, their big one right in front of them is, do we get on the boat that's about to leave the dock? Right. And here's an opportunity cost trade-off for us. We're going to have to give up choice 7 and 8. Do we want to do that? Right. Winhall, you're saying that's a big deal. Giving up choice K through 8 is a big deal. Right. But there is, when I come back around, originally I was very skeptical of our ability to form an SD. you know, coming back around to it, I'm saying, you know, you're not that far away from it either. I think it should be explored, not to say it is the answer, but it's definitely, when you start, it's exactly the same conclusion I came to. It's sort of like, well, you know, if these two people do that, you know, then you're really just left with that part. Whether they want to do that or not is another question.
Right?
What I'd be interested in suggesting from a financial analysis perspective is, as the one who's closest to the numbers, what, looking at the numbers, would be the most efficient, cost-efficient structure.
Right.
And what would the savings of that structure be, so that you've got, okay, this is the maximum, and then any changes that we make or any deviations from that, any alternatives we form are going to be less than that.
Yeah.
So that at least we could see, okay, that's as good as it could get from a cost perspective.
Yeah, I think I agree, and that's why I think the next sort of, if you want to have another general sort of conversation, I would encourage you to consider going through the Act 46 from the policy objective perspective, of which efficiency is one. So how best can you align the organization's structure to meet the policy objectives of the law? Efficiency, sustainable governance structure, and equity of opportunity. You know, how could we, you know, walk through a little metric on that? Because that would,
I think, you know,
you need to think about.
In a very simple way, Brian, you already answered that question, you know, earlier when you said, you know, you make it smaller, you're going to end up losing efficiency.
Well, and to Kristen's point, it's probably what we currently have as the BRSU, just with an alternative structure of fewer districts where we create certain efficiencies. But it would be nice to have that analysis, you know, where we see, okay, this is.
We could have some, you know, we could have some savings, but they're not going to, you know, they're not going to overcome the lack of people to spread the cost to.
Because then we get back to the first question, which is, you know, we're not going to decide on 10 cents because that's a one-time shot and this is a forever decision.
Right.
If that's, you know, if the difference is $100,000 a year versus $80,000.
That's
okay. Then we really need to look at other issues.
That's kind of
just
one
the cost savings.
You know, I thought, you know, Marty's point was really a good one. The old, you know, all we know is the three, and if we end up saying where we are today versus the three, and okay, you could probably drop some costs, but you're gonna be sharing those amongst fewer people. And you just kind of look at those two and say, if anybody else joins, it's going to fall, you know, in between those two, and that's probably going to, you know, going to be sufficient to give a good, you know, a decent handle on what the cost dynamics of the you know, of the SD versus the SU would be. So I'm just thinking that could be, you know, a quick and dirty on the SD with just 3 schools, and that's probably going to be enough to give you, you know, most of your answers.
I think Danny said it earlier, you know, there's an economy of scale, but sometimes when you add more, the economy gets more expensive. It doesn't really get cheaper.
Yeah, and it undermines your ability to be effective.
Right.
You know, so you have the efficiency metric, but then you have the effectiveness, sustainable governance, and the equity issue. And that's why I think nationally it's around 1,500. And I mean, it's a direct correlation between the variables you're talking about are the number of districts, number of schools.
Right.
You know, and the geography of it, you know, we're 460 square miles. That's a variable as well. Yep. You know. Yep. So those are the things that you really, you know, just from, if you had to design it on paper, you would say, yeah, okay, this is where we're going to see a geometric increase in our costs or lack of efficiency. If we add one more school or add another district, we're going to see something happen that, you know, whereas we could add 400 more kids, if we didn't add another governance structure or another school, we could accommodate it. You know,
well, the results, you know, when we added, you know, the red and wind hall, we actually became more efficient. It made it better. But interestingly, we did the analysis of adding Arlington, and it wasn't going to make it any better, you know, the BBSU. So, you know, it's not, yeah, it's not always a no-brainer. Right. But you know, we need just a gut, you know, basic feel, I think.
I would suggest that, I don't know how long everyone else wants to stick around, but I had 9 o'clock in my mind. It sounds like Dan kind of has at least some feeling of what he was looking for. The other big issue we've been kicking around is forming some sort of study committee. And I've heard sort of different ideas for that. Stephen's idea was sort of an autonomous committee. I guess my concern is honestly just leadership. That there's sort of, in order to form a functional multi-town committee, there needs to be some structure and some office to do it, right?
I nominate you.
So I guess I don't see any advantage of doing that over having it be a multi-board committee that invites public and invites other members of the committee. I mean, then we have an infrastructure to do it.
Right.
If we say, well, we're going to form this, 3-town committee, and somebody's got to own that and do the publicity and get the word out. So I don't see any advantage, frankly, in that over having it run by maybe the BRSU board and maybe the governance committee, but inviting more people and getting more people involved.
Yeah, and also to remember that we're elected and we represent our constituents and are responsible to them. So having been in on the early stages of the red, the Flood Brook board really did make that decision to go forward, and then we brought a lot of people in and went through the study committee and did lots of public information meetings and all of that stuff. But the initial decision, I think, is what we're paid the big bucks to do.
And John already is chair of the governance committee.
Thanks for pointing that out. Yeah, Lily.
If you're going to meet with the committee, bring in the community too. Just don't discount the amount of time it's going to take to educate them on what this actually means.
Right.
I mean, I know we've met at least twice this summer already, and I don't know what 5 hours worth of meetings. So how much time commitment are you going to get from the community to come and do that?
Right. Yeah, we need to develop a pretty specific structure with really specific, agenda and things we're trying to learn and find out and feel out in the community. I think may have a useful progress.
We could certainly, set up a BRSU governance committee after the 17th, just take stock of where we're at, figure out what you want to have studied.
And open it to everybody.
Yeah, do that in a bigger forum, not at the BRSU office. See if there's community members that want to join that process.
Yeah, we do have, with the group that we had over the summer, we had at least all the districts represented.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also had other people coming in who weren't on the BRSU board, which was great, and fully participating. So,
yeah.
Anybody feel strongly we should go a different route, or want to express concerns, or is everybody comfortable then with moving ahead and after the 17th having the BRSU board be in the governance committee and go from there? Anybody have anything else they want to do? Yeah.
I do have one more comment, and that is
I'm sorry, I don't have an answer for that right now.
That says it all.
If Siri can't answer it, I just wanted to let everyone know that we don't. I understand how we need to have thought it through and have a pretty good idea of where we need to go. We also don't want to be too far ahead of our constituency, because you can get yourself cut off and then people get angry and they feel like you've moved ahead without consulting. So that's why we've been proactive. Our plan in Dorset is to start to become as public as we can as soon as we can. So we're not jumping ahead, we're not trying to steal anybody's thunder, we just feel like it's really important to begin to air them out to the public so that it becomes more of a buzz and more of a community issue, because that's where it will end up ultimately with the votes. So our plan is at our next board meeting, we will have a session, perhaps as long as a half an hour to an hour, where we'll just review, we'll announce it to everybody, we'll review that we're going to talk about Act 46 and just explain what our understanding of it is at this point. And just as many people as can come should come and listen to it and just get an understanding. And that's the third Tuesday, I believe, of September, and then the third Tuesday of October, we will do a session where we try to get as many community members as possible to become engaged in understanding a logic model of the different parts of decisions that have to be made before you can get to the point where you can really decide on how do we respond to Act 46. And we have to, there are certain decision nodes, so we think we can set up a discussion of 3 or 4 steps that could take between an hour and a half and 2 hours, we hope, similar to what was done with the ends policies presentation that was done several years ago. That was very effective in our community, and we'd like to try to capture that same energy because it would be a positive, and that's really important. This whole process should be as positive as we can make it. So I just want to let you know that we are going, and if anyone wants to come and see how it goes, if it helps you with your ideas, then of course everyone's welcome.
Yeah, I agree. It's really important for every one of our boards to be educating the public as much as possible, starting yesterday. Yeah, we don't want anything to be a surprise. Anything else? Do you think we need to vote as individual boards to adjourn?
The chairs have that authority to unilaterally declare their boards adjourned, their meeting adjourned.
Meeting adjourned.
I now declare our meeting adjourned.
You adjourning us?
Actually, let's